Good morning, shalom, shalom to the sisters, and if any brothers are listening, shalom to you too. This is a continuation of a video I did yesterday in the sisters group, Woman Thou Art Loosed. I'm going to be reading from a book called The Creation of Patriarchy. I've added a link for a PDF version in the description, so you can read along if you want. This book is by Gerda Lerner, and it is from (1920). So I'm just going to read the note on chronology and methodology, and then chapter 1. There's a lot of women, that's reading the Bible today, and they still don't feel like they have a place there. So we're going to find out just why that is. Since events in ancient Mesopotamia were recorded by scribes in reference to the names of various rulers and officials, there is a problem of chronology when dealing with ancient Mesopotamia records. Let me get this on the screen. And share screen. So this is the book, The Creation of Patriarchy. And we're going to skip the acknowledgements and get to the methodology. So by cross-referencing the dates of rulers with significant astronomical events, which ancient scribes have recorded, scholars have arrived at an absolute chronology in calendar years for the first millennium BC. If one deals with events in the second and third millennium BC, one has only a relative sequence of events to work with. For the second millennium BC, scholars have constructed 3 chronologies, high, middle, and low, by comparing recorded dates of kings with astronomical data and with data from radiocarbon dated artifacts. Thus, all dates in this period are approximations. I have generally used middle chronology dating. Some discrepancy in the text have occurred where authorities I have cited have used a different method of dating, and my quotes from their text have reflected their dating. These discrepancies are particularly apparent in the dating of the pictures, where I have uniformly followed the dates listed by the respective museums, even when those dates disagreed with the dates in the text. I have followed the same policy in regard to the spelling of Mesopotamian names, unless otherwise noted. I have used the latest spellings, but I have retained the author's spelling in citations, even if it differs from the spelling I have used. When quoting passages translated from cuneiform text, I have followed the practice of letting square brackets stand for restorations in the text and round brackets for the translator's interpolations. Otherwise, in the text written by me, square brackets indicate the author's comments or interpolations. Another methodological problem common to all who work with ancient Mesopotamian sources is that the sources, while plentiful for certain periods and locations, are uneven as to time and place. Due to the vagaries of archaeological discoveries, we have a great deal of information about certain places and periods, little about others. This gives us an inevitably distorted picture of the past. Since there are far fewer sources concerning women than men, the problem is compounded for those dealing with the history of women. It is well to keep these constraints in mind when evaluating the generalizations offered. Introduction. Women's history is indispensable and essential to the emancipation of women. After 25 years of researching, writing, and teaching women's history, I have come to this conviction on theoretical and practical grounds. The theoretical argument will be more fully developed in this book. The practical argument rests on my observation of the profound changes in consciousness which students of women's history experience. Women's history changes their lives. Even short-term exposure to the past experience of women, such as in 2-week institutes and seminars, has the most profound psychological effect on women participants. And yet, most of the theoretical work of modern feminism, beginning with Simone de Beauvoir and continuing to the present, has been a historical and negligent of feminist historical scholarship. This was understandable in the early days of the new wave of feminism, when scholarship on the past of women was scant, but in the 1980s, when excellent scholarly work in women's history is abundantly available, the distance between historical scholarship and feminist criticism in other fields persists. Anthropologists, literary critics, sociologists, political scientists, and poets have offered theoretical work based on history, but the work of women's history specialists has not become part of the common discourse. I believe the reasons for this go beyond the sociology of the women doing feminist criticism and beyond the constraints of their academic background and training. The reasons lie in the conflict-ridden and highly problematic relationship of women to history. What is history? We must distinguish between the unrecorded past and all the events of the past as recollected by human beings, and history, the recorded and interpreted past. Like men, women are and always have been actors and agents in history. Since women are half and sometimes more than half of humankind, they always have shared the world and its work equally with men. Women are and have been central, not marginal, to the making of society and to the building of civilization. Women have also shared with men in preserving collective memory, which shapes the past into cultural tradition, provides the link between generations, and connects past and future. This oral tradition was kept alive in poem and myth, which both men and women created and preserved in folklore, art, and ritual. History making, on the other hand, is a historical creation which dates from the invention of writing in ancient Mesopotamia. From the time of the king list of ancient Sumer on, historians, whether priests, royal servants, clerks, clerics, or a professional class of university-trained intellectuals, have selected the events to be recorded and have interpreted them so as to give them meaning and significance. Until the most recent past, these historians have been men, and what they have recorded is what men have done and experienced and found significant. They have called this history and claimed universality for it. What women have done and experienced has been left unrecorded, neglected, and ignored in interpretation. Historical scholarship up to the most recent past has seen women as marginal to the making of civilization and as unessential to those pursuits defined as having historic significance. Thus, the recorded and interpreted record of the past of the human race is only a partial record in that it omits the past of half of humankind, and it is distorted in that it tells the story from the viewpoint of the male half of humanity only. To counter this argument, as has often been done, by showing that large groups of men possibly the majority of men, have also for a long time been eliminated from the historical record through the prejudiced interpretations of intellectuals representing the concerns of small ruling elites is to beg the question. One error does not cancel out another. Both conceptual errors need correction. As formerly subordinate groups such as peasants, slaves, proletarians have risen into positions of power or at least inclusion in the polity, their experiences have become part of the historical record. That is, the experiences of the males of their group. Females were, as usual, excluded. The point is that men and women have suffered exclusion and discrimination because of their class. No man has been excluded from the historical record because of his sex, yet all women were. Women have been kept from contributing to history making, that is, the ordering and interpretation of the past of humankind. Since this process of meaning giving is essential to the creation and perpetuation of civilization, we can see at once that women's marginality in this endeavor places us in a unique and segregate position. Women are the majority, yet we are structured into social institutions as though we were a minority. While women have been victimized by this and many other aspects of their long subordination to men, it is a fundamental error to try to conceptualize women primarily as victims. To do so at once obscures what must be assumed as a given of women's historical situation. Women are essential and central to creating society. They are and always have been actors and agents in history. Women have made history, yet they have been kept from knowing their history and from interpreting history, either their own or that of men. Women have been systematically excluded from the enterprise of creating symbol systems, philosophies, science, and law. Women have not only been educationally deprived throughout historical time in every known society, they have been excluded from theory formation. The tension between women's actual historical experience and their exclusion from interpreting that experience, I have called the dialect of women's history. This dialect has moved women forward in the historical process. The contradiction between women's centrality and active role in creating society and their marginality in the meaning-giving process of interpretation and explanation has been a dynamic force causing women to struggle against their condition. When in that process of struggle, at certain historic moments, the contradictions in their relationship to society and to historical process are brought into the consciousness of women, they are then correctly perceived and named as deprivations that women share as a group. This coming into consciousness of women becomes the dialectical force moving them into action to change their condition and to enter a new relationship to male-dominated society. Because of these conditions unique to themselves, women have had a historical experience significantly different from that of men. I began by asking the question, what are the definitions and concepts we need in order to explain the unique and segregate relationship of women to historical process, to making of history, and to the interpretation of their own past? Another question which I hope my study would address concerned the long delay over 3,500 years in women's coming to consciousness of their own subordinate position in society. What could explain it? What could explain women's historical complicity in upholding the patriarchal system that subordinated them and in transmitting that system that subordinated them and in transmitting that system generation after generation to their children of both sexes? Both of these are big and unpleasant questions because they appear to lead to answers indicating women's victimization and essential inferiority. I believe that That is the reason these questions have not earlier been addressed by feminist thinkers. Although traditional male scholarship has offered us the patriarchal answer, women have not produced important advances in thought because of their biologically determined preoccupation with nurturance and emotion, which led to their essential inferiority in regard to abstract thought. I began instead with the assumption that men and women are biologically different, but that the values and implications based on that difference are the result of culture. Whatever differences are discernible in the present in regard to men as a group and women as a group are the result of the particular history of women, which is essentially different from the history of men. This is due to the subordination of women to men, which is older than civilization, and to the denial of women's history. The existence of women's history has been obscured and neglected by patriarchal thought, a fact which has significantly affected the psychology of men and women. I began with the conviction shared by most feminist thinkers that patriarchy as a system is historical. It has a beginning in history. If that is so, it can be ended by historical process. If patriarchy were natural, that is, based on biological determinism, then to change it would mean to change nature. One might argue that changing nature is precisely what civilization has done, but that so far, most of the benefits of that domination over nature, which men call progress, has accrued to the male of the species. Why and how this happened are historical questions, regardless of how one explains the causes of female subordination. My own hypothesis on the causes and origins of women's subordination will be more fully discussed in chapters 1 and 2. What is important to my analysis is the insight that the relation of men and women to the knowledge of their past is in itself a shaping force in the making of history. If it were the case that the subordination of women antedated Western civilization, assuming that civilization to have begun with the written historical record, my inquiry had to begin in the 4th millennium BC. This is what led me, an American historian specializing in the 19th century, to spend the last 8 years working in the history of ancient Mesopotamia in order to answer the questions I consider essential to creating a feminist theory of history. Although questions of origin initially interested me, I soon realized that they were far less significant than questions about the historical process by which patriarchy becomes established and institutionalized. This process was manifested in changes in kinship, organization, and economic relations, in the establishment of religious and state bureaucracies, and in the shift in cosmogonies expressing the ascendancy of male god figures. Basing myself on existing theoretical work, I assume these changes occurred as an event in a relatively short period, which might have coincided with the establishment of archaic states, or which might have occurred perhaps somewhat earlier, at the time of the establishment of private property, which brought class society into being. Under the influence of Marxist theories of origin, which will be more fully discussed in chapter 1, I envisioned a kind of revolutionary overthrow which would have visibly altered existing power relations in society. I expected to find economic changes leading to changes in ideas and religious explanatory systems. Specifically, I was looking for visible changes in the economic, political, and juridical status of women. But as I entered into the study of the rich sources in the history of the ancient Near East and began to look at them in historical sequence, it became clear to me that my assumption had been too simplistic. The problem is not one of sources, for these are certainly ample for the reconstruction of a social history of ancient Mesopotamian society. The problem of interpretation is similar to the problem faced by a historian in any field approaching traditional history with questions pertaining to women. There is little substantive work on women available, and what there is purely descriptive. No interpretations or generalizations concerning women have as yet been offered by specialists trained in the field. Thus, the history of women and the history of the changing relations of the sexes in Mesopotamian societies still need to be written. I have the greatest respect for the scholarship and technical and linguistic knowledge of scholars working in ancient Near Eastern studies, and am certain that from among their ranks will eventually come a work which will synthesize and put into proper perspective the largely untold story of women's changing social, political, and economic status in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. Not being a trained Assyriologist and being unable to read the cuneiform text in their original languages, I did not attempt to write such a history. I did, however, observe that the sequence of events seemed to be rather different from what I had anticipated. While the formation of archaic states, which followed upon or coincided with major economic, technological, and military changes, brought with it distinct shifts in power relations among men and among men and women, there was nowhere evidence of an overthrow. The period of the establishment of patriarchy was not one event, but a process developing over a period of nearly 2,500 years, from approximately 3100 to 600 BC. It occurred even within the ancient Near East at a different pace and at different times in several distinct societies. Further, women seem to have greatly different status in different aspects of their lives, so that, for example, in Babylon in the 2nd millennium BC, women's sexuality was totally controlled by men. While some women enjoyed great economic independence, many legal rights and privileges had and held many important high status positions in society. I was puzzled to find that the historical evidence pertaining to women made little sense when judged by traditional criteria. After a while, I began to see that I needed to focus more on the control of women's sexuality and procreativity than on the usual economic questions. So I began to look for the causes and effects of such sexual control. As I did this, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. I had been unable to comprehend the meaning of the historical evidence before me because I looked at class formation as it applied to men and women, with the traditional assumption that what was true for men was true for women. When I began to ask how class definition was different for women than for men at the very inception of class society, the evidence before me made sense. I will, in this book, develop the following propositions. The appropriation by men of women's sexual and reproductive capacity occurred prior to the formation of private property and class society. Its commodification lies, in fact, at the foundation of private property. The archaic states were organized in the form of patriarchy. Thus, from its inception, the state had an essential interest in the maintenance of the patriarchal family. Men learned to institute dominance and hierarchy over other people by their earlier practice of dominance over the women of their own group. This found expression in the institutionalization of slavery, which began with the enslavement of women of conquered groups. Women's sexual subordination was institutionalized in the earliest law codes and enforced by the full power of the state. Women's cooperation in the system was secured by various means: force, economic dependency on the male head of the family, class privileges bestowed upon conforming and dependent women of the upper classes, and the artificially created division of women into respectable and not respectable women. Class for men was and is based on their relationship to the means of production. Those who owned the means of production could dominate those who did not. For women, class is mediated through their sexual ties to a man, who then gives them access to material resources. The division of women into respectable, that is attached to one man, and not respectable, that is not attached to one man or free of all men, is institutionalized in laws pertaining to the veiling of women. Long after women are sexually and economically subordinated to men, they still play active and respected roles in mediating between humans and gods as priestesses, seers, diviners, and healers. Metaphysical female power, especially the power to give life, is worshipped by men and women in the form of powerful goddesses long after women are subordinated to men in most aspects of their lives on earth. The dethroning of the powerful goddesses and their replacement by a dominant male god occur in most Near Eastern societies following the establishment of a strong and imperialistic kingship. Gradually, the function of controlling fertility, formerly entirely held by the goddesses, is symbolized through the symbolic or actual mating of the male god or god king with the goddess or her priestess. Finally, sexuality or eroticism and procreativity are split in the emergence of separate goddesses for each function, and the mother goddess is transformed into the wife or consort of the chief male god. The emergence of Hebrew monotheism takes the form of an attack on the widespread cults of the various fertility goddesses. In the writing of the book of Genesis, creativity and procreativity are ascribed to all-powerful God, whose epithets of Lord and King establish him as a male god, and female sexuality, other than for procreative purposes, becomes associated with sin and evil. In the establishment of the covenant community, the basic symbolism and the actual contract between God and humanity assumes as a given the subordinate position of women and their exclusion from the metaphysical covenant and the earthly covenant community. Their only access to God and to the holy community is their function as mothers. This symbolic devaluing of women in relation to the divine becomes one of the founding metaphors of Western civilization. The other founding metaphor is supplied by Aristotelian philosophy, which assumes as a given that women are incomplete and damaged human beings of an entirely different order than men. It is with the creation of these two metaphorical constructs, which are built into the very foundations of the symbol systems of Western civilization, that the subordination of women comes to be seen as natural. Hence, it becomes invisible. It is this which finally establishes patriarchy firmly as an actuality and as an ideology. Oops. What is the relationship of ideas? And specifically of ideas about gender to the social and economic forces that shape history. The matrix of any idea is reality. People cannot conceive of something they have not themselves experienced, or at least that others have before them experienced. Thus, images, metaphors, myths all find expression in forms which are prefigured through past experience. In periods of change, people reinterpret these symbols in new ways, which then lead to new combinations and new insights. What I am attempting to do in my book is to trace by means of historical evidence the development of the leading ideas, symbols, and metaphors by which patriarchal gender relations were incorporated into Western civilization. Each chapter is built around one of these metaphors for gender, as indicated by the chapter title. In this book, I have endeavored to isolate and identify the forms in which Western civilization constructed gender and to study them at moments or in periods of change. These forms consist of social norms embodied in social roles, in laws, and in metaphors. In a way, these forms represent historical artifacts from which it is possible to deduce the social reality which gave rise to the idea or to the metaphor. By tracing the changes in metaphor or image, it should be possible to trace the underlying historical developments in society, even in the absence of other historical evidence. In the case of Mesopotamian society, the abundance of historical evidence makes it possible, in most cases, to confirm one's analysis of symbols by comparison with such hard evidence. The major gender symbols and metaphors of Western civilization were largely derived from Mesopotamian and later from Hebrew sources. It would, of course, be desirable to extend this study so as to include Arabic, Egyptian, and European influences, but such an enterprise would demand more years of scholarly work than I can. Okay, so continuing. Okay, so scrolling down. As we undertake this exploration, how are we then to think of women as a group? 3 metaphors may help us see from our new angle of vision. In her brilliant 1979 article, Joan Kelly spoke of the new double vision of feminist scholarship. And moving beyond the split vision of social reality it inherited from the recent past, our actual vantage point has shifted, giving rise to a new consciousness of women's place in family and society. What we see are not 2 spheres of social reality, home and work, private and public, but 2 or 3 sets of social relations. We are adding the female vision to the male, and that process is transforming. But Joan Kelly's metaphor needs to be developed one step further. When we see with one eye, our vision is limited in range and devoid of depth. When we add to it the single vision of the other eye, our range of vision becomes wider, but we still lack depth. It is only when both eyes see together that we accomplish full range of vision and accurate depth perception. The computer provides us with another metaphor. The computer shows us a picture of a triangle, 2-dimensional, still holding that image. The triangle moves in space and is transformed into a pyramid, 3-dimensional. Now the pyramid moves in space, creating a curve, the 4th dimension. While still holding the image of the pyramid and the triangle, we see all 4 dimensions at once, losing none of them, but seeing them also in their true relation to one another. Seeing as we have seen in patriarchal terms is 2-dimensional. Adding women to the patriarchal framework makes it 3-dimensional, but only when the 3rd dimension is fully integrated and moves with the whole. Only when women's vision is equal with men's vision do we perceive the true relations of the whole and the interconnectedness of the parts. Finally, another image. Men and women live on a stage on which they act out their assigned roles, equal in importance. The play cannot go on without both kinds of performers. Neither of them contributes more or less to the whole. Neither is marginal or dispensable, but the stage set is conceived, painted, defined by men. Men have written the play, have directed the show, interpreted the meanings of the action. They have assigned themselves the most interesting, most heroic parts, giving women the supporting roles. As the women become aware of the difference in the way they fit into the play, they ask for more equality in the role assignments. They upstage the men at times. At other times, they pinch hit for a missing male performer. The women finally, after considerable struggle, win the right of access to equal role assignment, but first they must qualify, quote unquote. The terms of their qualifications are again set by the men. Men are the judges of how women measure up. Men grant or deny admission. They give preference to docile women and to those who fit their job description accurately. Men punish by ridicule, exclusion, or ostracism any woman who assumes the right to interpret her own role, or worst of all sins, the right to rewrite the script. It takes considerable time for the women to understand that getting equal parts will not make them equal, as long as the script, the props, the stage setting, and the direction are firmly held by men. When the women began to realize that and cluster together between the acts or even during the performance to discuss what to do about it, this play comes to an end. Looking at the recorded history of society as though it were such a play, we realize that the story of the performances over thousands of years has been recorded only by men and told in their words. Their attention has been mostly on men. Not surprisingly, they have not noticed all the actions women have taken. Finally, in the past 50 years, some women have acquired the training necessary for writing the company's scripts. As they wrote, they began to pay more attention to what women were doing. Still, they had been well trained by their male mentors. So they too found what men were doing on the whole more significant, and in their desire to upgrade the part of women in the past, they looked hard for women who had done what men did. Thus, compensatory history was born. What women must do, what feminists are now doing, is to point to that stage, its sets, its props, its director, and its scriptwriter, as did the child in the fairy tale who discovered that the emperor was naked, and say, the basic inequality between us lies within this framework, and then they must tear it down. What will the writing of history be like when that umbrella of dominance is removed and definition is shared equally by men and women? Will we devalue the past, overthrow the categories, supplant order with chaos? No. We will simply step out under the free sky. We will observe how it changes, how the stars rise and the moon circles, and we will describe the earth and its workings in male and female voices. We may, after all, see with greater enrichment. We now know that man is not the measure of that which is human, but men and women are. Men are not the center of the world, but men and women are. This insight will transform consciousness as decisively as did Copernicus's discovery that the earth is not the center of the universe. We may play our separate parts on the stage, sometimes exchanging them or deciding to keep them as it works out. We may discover new talent among those who have always been living under the umbrella of another's making. We may find that those who had previously taken upon themselves the burden of both action and definition may now have more freedom for playing and experiencing the pure joy of existence. We are no more under an obligation to describe what we will find than were the explorers sailing to the distant edge of the world, only to find that the world was round. We will never know unless we begin. The process itself is the way, is the goal. Chapter 1, Origins. The shreds of hard evidence, tools, graves, pottery shards, the remains of dwellings and shrines, the ambiguous artifacts on cave walls, skeletal remains, and the story they tell, all these lie before us in bewildering diversity. We tie them together with myths and speculation. We match them against what we know of primitive people surviving into the present. We use science, philosophy, religion to construct a model of that distant past before civilization began. The approach we use in interpretation, our conceptual framework, determines the outcome. Such a framework is never value-free. We ask the questions of the past we want answered in the present. For long periods of historical time, the conceptual framework which formed our questions was assumed as a given, undiscussed and unchallengeable. As long as the Christian teleological view dominated historical thought, pre-Christian history was seen merely as a preparatory stage for the true history, which began with the birth of Christ and would end with the second coming. When Darwinian theory dominated historical thought, prehistory was seen as a barbaric stage in the evolutionary progress of humankind from the simpler to the more complex. That which succeeded and survived was by the very fact of its survival considered superior to that which vanished and had thus, quote unquote, failed. As long as androcentric assumptions dominated our interpretations, we read the sex gender arrangements prevailing in the present backward into the past. Let's look that word up. Androcentric. So androcentric means focused or centered on men. So we assumed existence of male dominance as a given and considered any evidence to the contrary merely an exception to the rule or a failed alternative. Traditionalists, whether working with a religious or a scientific framework, have regarded women's subordination as universal, God-given, or natural, hence immutable. Thus, it need not be questioned. What has survived, survived because it was best. It follows that it should stay that way. Scholars critical of androcentric assumptions and those seeing the need for social change in the present have challenged the concept of the universality of female subordination. They reason that if the system of patriarchal dominance had a historic origin, it could be ended under altered historical conditions. Therefore, the question of the universality of female subordination has, for over 150 years, been central to the debate between traditionalists and feminist thinkers. 1 second. Okay. So, scholars critical of androcentric assumptions and those seeing the need for social change in the present have challenged the concept of the universality of female subordination. They reason that if the system of patriarchal dominance had a historic origin, it could be ended under altered historical conditions. Therefore, the question of the universality of female subordination has, for over 150 years, been central to the debate between traditionalist and feminist thinkers. For those critical of patriarchal explanations, the next important question is, if female subordination was not universal, then was there ever an alternative model of society? This question has most often taken the form of the search for a matriarchal society in the past. Since much of the evidence in this search derives from myth, religion, and symbol, there has been little attention given to historical evidence. For the historian, the more important and significant question is this: how, when, and why did female subordination come into existence? Therefore, before we can undertake a discussion of the historical development of patriarchy, we need to review the major positions in the debate on these three questions. The traditionalist answer to the first question is, of course, that male dominance is universal and natural. The argument may be offered in religious terms. Woman is subordinate to man because she was so created by God. Traditionalists accept the phenomenon of sexual asymmetry, the assignment of different tasks and roles to men and women, which has been observed in all known human societies, as proof of their position and as evidence of its naturalness. Since woman was, by divine design, assigned a different biological function than man was, they argue, she should also be assigned different social tasks. If God or nature created sex differences, which in turn determined the sexual division of labor, no one is to blame for sexual inequality and male dominance. The traditionalist explanation focuses on woman's reproductive capacity and sees in motherhood woman's chief goal in life, by implication defining as deviant women who do not become mothers. Woman's maternal function is seen as a species necessity, since societies could not have survived into modernity without the majority of women devoting most of their adult lives to childbearing and child rearing. Thus, the sexual division of labor based on biological differences is seen as functional and just. A corollary explanation of sexual asymmetry locates the causes of female subordination in biological factors affecting males. Men's greater physical strength, their ability to run faster and lift heavier weights, and their greater aggressiveness cause them to become hunters. As such, they become the providers of food for their tribes and are more highly valued and honored than women. Lost my place. 1 second. Really lost my place. Okay. The skills deriving from their hunting experience in turn equip them to become warriors. Man, the hunter, superior in strength, ability, and the experience derived from using tools and weapons naturally, quote unquote, protects and defends the more vulnerable female whose biological equipment destines her for motherhood and nurturance. Finally, this biological deterministic explanation is determined from the Stone Age into the present by assertion that the sexual division of labor based on man's natural superiority is a given and therefore as valid today as it was in the primitive beginnings of human society. This theory, in various forms, is currently by far the most popular version of the traditionalist argument and has had a powerful explanatory and reinforcing effect on contemporary ideas of male supremacy. This is probably due to its scientific trappings based on selected ethnographic evidence and on the fact that it seems to account for male dominance in such a way as to relieve contemporary men of all responsibility for it. The profound way in which this explanation has affected even feminist theoreticians is evident in its partial acceptance by Simone de Beauvoir, who takes as a given that man's transcendence derives from hunting and warfare and the use of tools necessary for these pursuits. Quite apart from its dubious biological claims of male physical superiority, the man, the hunter explanation has been disproven by anthropological evidence concerning hunting and gathering activities and small game hunting, which women and children do. Also, as we will see below, it is precisely in hunting and gathering societies that we find many examples of complementarity between the sexes and societies in which women have relatively high status, which is in direct contradiction to the claims of the man-hunter school of thought. Feminist anthropologists have recently challenged many of the earlier generalizations, which found male dominance virtually universal in all known societies, as being patriarchal assumptions on the part of ethnographers and investigators of those cultures. When feminist anthropologists have reviewed the data or done their own fieldwork, they have found male dominance to be far more universal. They have found societies in which sexual asymmetry carries no connotation of dominance or subordination. Rather, the tasks performed by both sexes are indispensable to group survival, and both sexes are regarded as equal in status in most aspects. In such societies, the sexes are considered complementary. Their roles and status are different but equal. Another way in which man-the-hunter theories have been disproven is by showing the essential, culturally innovative contributions women made to the creation of civilization by their invention of basketry and pottery and their knowledge and development of horticulture. Elise Boulding, in particular, has shown that the man-the-hunter myth and its perpetuation are social cultural creations which serve the interest of maintaining male supremacy and hegemony. Traditionalist defenses of male supremacy based on biological deterministic reasoning have changed over time and proven remarkably adaptive and resilient. When the force of the religious argument was weakened in the 19th century, the traditionalist explanation of women's inferiority became scientific. Darwinian theories reinforced beliefs that species survival was more important than individual self-fulfillment. Much as the social gospel used the Darwinian idea of the survival of the fittest to justify the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege in American society. Scientific defenders of patriarchy justified the definition of women through their maternal role and their exclusion from economic and educational opportunities as serving the best interests of species survival. It was because of their biological constitution and their maternal function that women were considered unsuited for higher education and for many vocational pursuits. Menstruation and menopause, even pregnancy, were regarded as debilitating, as disease or abnormal states, which incapacitated women and rendered them actually inferior. Similarly, modern psychology observed existing sex differences with the unquestioned assumption that they were natural, and constructed a psychological female who was a biologically determined and had been for forebears. Viewing sex roles ahistorically, psychologists had to arrive at conclusions from observed clinical data which reinforced predominant gender roles. Sigmund Freud's theories further reinforced the traditionalist explanation. Freud's normal human was male. The female was, by his definition, a deviant human being lacking a penis, whose entire physiological structure supposedly centered on the struggle to compensate for this deficiency. Even though many aspects of Freudian theory would prove helpful in constructing feminist theory, it was Freud's dictum that for the female, anatomy is destiny, which gave new life and strength to male supremacist argument. The often vulgarized applications of Freudian theory to child rearing and to popular advice literature lent new prestige to the old argument that woman's primary role is a childbearer and child rearer. It was popularized Freudian doctrine, which became the prescriptive text for educators, social workers, and the general audiences of the mass media. Recently, E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology has offered the traditionalist view on gender in an argument which applies Darwinian ideas of natural selection to human behavior. Wilson and his followers reasoned that human behaviors, which are adaptive for group survival, become encoded in the genes, and they include in these behaviors such complex traits as altruism, loyalty, and maternalism. They not only reason that groups practicing a sex-based division of labor in which women function as child rearers and nurturers have an evolutionary advantage, but they claim such behavior somehow becomes part of our genetic heritage, in that the necessary psychological and physical propensities for such societal arrangements are selectively developed and genetically selected. Mothering is not only a socially assigned role, but one fitting women's physical and psychological needs. Here, once again, biological determinism becomes prescriptive. In fact, a political defense of the status quo in scientific language. Feminist critics have revealed the circular reasoning, absence of evidence, and unscientific assumptions of Wilsonian sociobiology. From the point of view of the non-scientist, the most obvious fallacy of sociobiologists is their ahistoricity in disregarding the fact that modern men and women do not live in a state of nature. The history of civilization describes the process by which humans have distanced themselves from nature by inventing and perfecting culture. Traditionalists ignore technological changes which have made it possible to bottle feed infants safely and raise them to adulthood with caretakers other than their own mothers. They ignore the implications of changing lifespans and changing life cycles. Until communal hygiene and modern medical knowledge cut infant mortality to a level where parents could reasonably expect each child born to them to live to adulthood, women did indeed have to bear many children in order for a few of them to survive. Similarly, longer life expectancy and lower infant mortality altered the life cycles of both men and women. These developments were connected with industrialization and occurred in Western civilization for whites toward the end of the 19th century, occurring later for the poor and for minorities due to the uneven distribution of health and social services. Whereas up to 1870, child rearing and marriage were coterminous. That is, one or both parents could expect to die before the youngest child reached adulthood. In modern American society, husbands and wives can expect to live together for 12 years after their youngest child has reached adulthood, and women can expect to outlive their husbands by 7 years. Nevertheless, traditionalists expect women to follow the same roles and occupations that were functional and species essential in the Neolithic. They accept cultural changes by which men have freed themselves from biological necessity. The supplanting of hard physical labor by the labor of machines is considered progress. Only women, in their view, are doomed forever to species service through their biology. To claim that all human activities, only female nurturance, is unchanging and eternal is indeed to co-sign half the human race to a lower state of existence, to nature rather than to culture. The qualities which may have fostered human survival in the Neolithic are no longer required of modern people, regardless of whether qualities such as aggressiveness or nurturance are genetically or culturally transmitted. It should be obvious that the aggressiveness of males, which have been highly functional in the Stone Age, is threatening human survival in the nuclear age. At a time when overpopulation and exhaustion of natural resources represent a real danger for human survival, to curb women's procreative capacities may be more adaptive than to foster them. Further, in opposition to any argument based on biological determinism, feminists challenge the hidden androcentric assumptions in the sciences dealing with humans. They have charged that in biology, anthropology, zoology, and psychology, such assumptions have led to a reading of scientific evidence that distorts its meaning. Thus, for example, animal behavior is invested with anthropomorphic significance, which makes patriarchs of male chimpanzees. Many feminists argue that the limited number of proven biological differences among the sexes has been vastly exaggerated by cultural interpretations, and that the value put on sex differences is in itself a cultural product. Sexual attributes are a biological given, but gender is a product of historical process. The fact that women bear children is due to sex. That women nurture children is due to gender, a cultural construct. It is gender which has been chiefly responsible for fixing women's place in society. Let us now look briefly at the theories which deny the universality of female subordination and which postulate an earlier stage of either female dominance, matriarchy, or female equality with men. The main explanations are Marxist, economic, and maternalist. Marxist analysis has been very influential in determining the questions asked by feminist scholars. The basic work of reference is Friedrich Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, which describes the world historic defeat of the female sex as an event deriving from the development of private property. Engels, basing his generalizations on the work of 19th century ethnographers and theoreticians such as J.J. Bachofen and L.H. Morgan, postulated the existence of classless communist societies prior to the formation of private property. Such societies may or may not have been matriarchal, but they were egalitarian. Engels assumed a primitive division of labor between the sexes. The man fights in the wars, goes hunting and fishing, procures the raw materials of food and the tools necessary for doing so. The woman looks after the house and the preparation of the food and clothing, cooks, weaves, sews. They are each master in their own sphere, the man in the forest, the woman in the house. Each is owner of the instruments which he or she makes and uses. What is made and used in common is common property: the house, the garden, the longboat. Engels' description of the primitive sexual division of labor reads curiously like a description of European peasant households read back into prehistory. The ethnographic information on which he based these generalizations has been disproven. In most primitive societies of the past and in all hunting-gathering societies still existent today, women provide on the average 60% or more of the food. To do so, they often range far from home, carrying their babies and children with them. Further, the assumption that there is one formula and one pattern for the sexual division of labor is erroneous. The particular work done by men and women has differed greatly in different cultures, largely depending on the ecological situation in which the people find themselves. Engels theorized that in tribal societies, the development of animal husbandry led to commerce and to ownership of herds by individual heads of families, presumably male. But he was unable to explain how this took place. Surpluses from herding were appropriated by men and became private property. Once having acquired such private property, men sought to secure it to themselves and their heirs. They did so by instituting the monogamous family, by controlling women's sexuality through the requirement of prenuptial chastity, and by the establishment of the sexual double standard in marriage. Men assured themselves of the legitimacy of their offspring and thus secured their property interests. Engels stressed the connection between the breakdown of older kinship relations based on communal property ownership and the emergence of the individual family as the economic unit. With the development of the state, the monogamous family changed into the patriarchal family, in which the wife's household labor became a private service. The wife became the head servant, excluded from all participation in social production. Engels concluded, the overthrow of the mother right was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command of the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. Engels used the term Mutterrecht, hereafter referred to as mother right, derived from Bachelven, to describe matrilineal kinship relations in which the property of men did not pass to their children, but to their sisters' children. He also accepted Bachelven's model of the historic progression in family structure from group marriage to monogamous marriage. He reasoned that monogamous marriage was viewed by woman as an improvement in her condition, since with it she acquired the right to give herself to one man only. Engels also called attention to the institutionalization of prostitution, which he described as an indispensable prop for monogamous marriage. Engels' speculations on the nature of female sexuality have been criticized as reflecting his own sexist Victorian values in their unexamined assumption that 19th century standards of female prudery could explain the actions and attitudes of women at the dawn of civilization. Yet, Engels made major contributions to our understanding of women's position in society and history. One, he pointed to the connection between structural changes in kinship relations and changes in the division of labor on the one hand and women's position in society on the other. He showed a connection between the establishment of private property, monogamous marriage, and prostitution. He showed the connection between economic and political dominance by men and their control over female sexuality. By locating the world historical defeat of the female sex in the period of the formation of archaic states, based on the dominance of propertied elites, he gave the event historicity. Although he was unable to prove any of these propositions, he defined the major theoretical questions for the next 300 years. He also limited the discussion of the woman question by offering a persuasive single cause explanation and directing attention to a single event. Women's enslavement was the development of private property and the institutions that evolved from it. Then it followed logically that the abolition of private property would liberate women. In any case, most of the theoretical work done on the question of the origin of women's subordination has been directed toward proving, improving, or disproving Engels' work. Engels' basic assumption about the nature of the sexes were based on the acceptance of evolutionary theories of biology. But his great merit was to point up the impact of societal and cultural forces in structuring and defining sexual relations. Parallel to his model of social relations, he developed an evolutionary theory of sex relations, in which monogamous marriage among the working classes in a socialist society stood at the apex of development. In thus linking sexual relations to changing social relations, he broke with the biological determinism of the traditionalists. In his calling attention to the sexual conflict built into the institution as it emerged within private property relations, he reinforced the linkage between economic social change and what we today would call gender relations. He defined monogamous marriage as formed in early state society as the subjection of one sex by the other as the proclamation of a conflict between the sexes entirely unknown hitherto in prehistoric times. He continued significantly. The first class opposition that appears in history coincides the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriages and the first class oppression with that of the female sex by the male. These statements These statements offer many promising avenues for theory building, about which more will be said below. But Engels' identification of the relation of the sexes as class antagonism has been a dead end, which for a long time kept theorists from properly understanding the differences between class relations and relations between the sexes. This was compounded by the insistence of Marxists that questions of sex relations must be subordinated to questions of class relations, expressed not only theoretically but in practical politics, wherever they had the power to do so. New feminist scholarship has only recently begun to forge the theoretical tools with which to correct these errors. The structuralist anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss also offers a theoretical explanation in which women's subordination is crucial to the formation of culture. But unlike Engels, Levi-Strauss postulates a single building block out of which men constructed culture. Levi-Strauss sees in the incest taboo a universal human mechanism, which lies at the root of all social organization. The prohibition of incest is less a rule prohibiting marriage with the mother, sister, or daughter than a rule obliging the mother, sister, or daughter to be given to others. It is the supreme rule of the gift. The exchange of women is the first form of trade in which women are turned into a commodity and are reified, that is, they are thought of more as things than as human beings. The exchange of women, according to Levi-Strauss, marks the beginning of women's subordination. It in turn reinforces a sexual division of labor, which institutes male dominance. Levi-Strauss nevertheless sees the incest taboo as a positive and necessary step forward in creating human culture. We know who that is. Taboos on endogamy and incest structured peaceful interaction and led to alliances among tribes.
I say that.
Go ahead.
That's the reason why their culture is so messed up. They really believe that incest was detrimental to their culture. That's what they did. They read stories in the Bible and they misinterpret it.
Mm-hmm. The anthropologist Gail Rubin accurately defines this exchange system as it impinges on women. Exchange of women in shorthand for expressing that the social relations of kinship system specify that men have certain rights and female kin, and that women do not have the same rights in their male kin. It is a system in which women do not have full rights to themselves. We should note that in Levi-Strauss's theory, men are the actors who impose a set of structures and relations on women. Such an explanation cannot be considered adequate. How did this happen? Why was it women who were exchanged? Why not men or small children of both sexes? Even granting the functional usefulness of the arrangement, why would women have agreed to it? We will explore these questions further in the next chapter in our effort to construct a workable hypothesis. Levi Strauss's considerable impact on feminist theories has resulted in a shift in attention from the search for economic origins to the study of the symbolic and meaning systems of societies. The most influential work was Sherry Ortner's 1974 essay, in which she persuasively argued that in every known society, women are identified as being closer to nature than to culture. Since every culture devalues nature as it strives to rise above it through mastery, women become symbolic of an inferior, intermediate order of being. Ortner showed that women were so identified because, one, woman's body and its function seemed to place her closer to nature. Two, woman's body and its functions place her in social roles that, in turn, are considered to be at a lower order of the cultural process than man's. And three, woman's traditional social roles imposed because of her body and its functions, in turn, give her a different psychic structure, which is seen as being closer to nature. This brief essay provoked a long and highly informative debate among feminist anthropologists and theorists, which still continues. Ortner and those who agree with her argue strongly for the universality of female subordination, if not in actual social conditions, then in the meaning systems of society. Opponents of this viewpoint object to the claim of universality, criticize its ahistoricity, and reject the placing of women in the position of passive victims. Finally, they challenge the implicit acceptance in the feminist structuralist position of the existence of an unchanging and immutable dichotomy between male and female. This is not the place to do justice to the richness and sophistication of this ongoing feminist debate, but the discussion of the universality of female subordination has already yielded so many alternative explanations that even those who answer it positively are aware of the shortcomings of that question setting. More and more, as the debate deepens, it becomes clear that single cause explanations and claims of universality will not adequately answer the question of causes. The great merit of the functionalist position is to reveal the narrowness of merely economic explanations, while those inclined to emphasize biology and economics are now forced to deal with the power of belief systems, symbols, and mental constructs. Above all, the commonly held belief of most feminists in the social construction of gender poses a most serious intellectual challenge to traditional explanations. There is another theoretical position which deserves our serious consideration. First, because it is feminist in focus and intent, and second, because it represents a historic tradition and thought about women. Maternalist theory is built upon the acceptance of biological sex differences as a given. Most feminist maternalists also consider the sexual division of labor built upon these biological differences as inevitable. Although some recent thinkers have revised that position, maternalists sharply differ from the traditionalists in reasoning from this for women's equality and even for the superiority of women. The first major explanatory theory built on maternalist principles was developed by J.J. Backoffen in his highly influential book, Das Mutterrecht. Backhoffen's work influenced Ingalls and Charlotte Perkins Gilman and is paralleled in the thought of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. A wide array of 20th century feminists accepted his ethnographic data and his analysis of literary sources and used them to construct a wide range of differing theories. Backoffen's ideas also strongly influenced Robert Brefeld, as well as a school of Jungian analysts and theorists whose work has had wide popular appeal and currency in 20th century America. Backoffen's basic framework was evolutionist and Darwinian. He described various stages in the evolution of society, leading steadily upward from barbarism to modern patriarchy. Backoffen's original contribution was to claim that women in primitive society developed culture and that there was a stage of matriarchy which led society out of barbarism. Bakoven speaks eloquently and poetically of this stage. At the lowest, darkest stage of human existence, mother-child love was the only light in the moral darkness. Raising her young, the woman learns earlier than the man to extend her loving care beyond the limits of the ego to another creature. Woman at this stage is the repository of all culture, of all benevolence, of all devotion, of all concern for the living and grief for the dead. Despite his high valuation of women's role in the dim past, Bakoven regarded the ascendancy of patriarchy in Western civilization as the triumph of superior religious and political thought and organization, which he contrasted negatively with historic development in Asia and Africa. But he advocated, as did his followers, the incorporation of the feminine principle of nurturance and altruism in modern society. 19th century American feminists developed a full-blown maternalist theory based not so much on Bakoven as on their own redefinition of the patriarchal doctrine of women's separate sphere. Yet, there are close parallels in their thinking to Bakoven's ideas of innate positive feminine characteristics. 19th century feminists, both in America and in England, considered women more altruistic than men because of their maternal instincts and lifelong practice, and more virtuous because of their allegedly weaker sex drives. They believed that these characteristics, which unlike Bakoven, they frequently ascribed to women's historic role as nurturers, gave women a special mission to rescue society from the destructiveness, competition, and violence created by men holding unchallenged dominance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in particular, developed an argument which blended natural rights philosophy and American nationalism with maternalism. Stanton wrote at a time when traditionalist ideas about gender were being redefined in the young American Republic. In colonial America, as in 18th century Europe, women had been regarded as subordinate to and dependent on their male relatives within the family, even as they were considered, especially in the colonies and under frontier conditions, partners in economic life. They had been excluded from equal access to education and from participation and power in public life. Now, as men created a new nation, they assigned to woman the new role of mother of the republic, responsible for the raising of male citizens who would lead society. Republican women were now to be sovereign in the domestic sphere, even as men more firmly claimed the public sphere, including economic life, as their exclusive domain. Sex-determined separate spheres, as defined in the Cult of True Womanhood, became the prevalent ideology. As men institutionalized their dominance in the economy, in education, and in politics, women were encouraged to adjust to their subordinate status by an ideology which gave their maternal function higher significance. In the early decades of the 19th century, American women in practice and thought redefined on their own the position they should hold in society. While early feminists accepted the existence of separate spheres as a given, they transformed the meaning of this concept by arguing for woman's right and duty to enter the public sphere because of the superiority of her values and the strength embodied in her maternal role. Stanton transformed the separate sphere doctrine into a feminist argument by reasoning that women were entitled to equality because they were citizens and thus enjoyed the same natural rights as men, and because as mothers, they were better equipped than men to improve society. A similar maternalist feminist argument was manifest in the ideology of the later suffrage movement and of those reformers who argued with Jane Addams that women's work properly extended to municipal housekeeping. Interestingly, modern feminist maternalists have reasoned similarly, basing their argument on psychological data and on the evidence of women's historical experience as outsiders to political power. Dorothy Dinnerstein, Mary O'Brien, and Adrienne Rich are the latest in a long line of maternalists. Because of their acceptance of biological sex differences as determinant, 19th century maternalists were not as concerned with the question of origins as were their 20th century followers. But from the beginning, with Bakoven, the denial of the universality of female subordination was implicit in the maternalist evolutionary position. There had been an alternative model of human social organization before patriarchy, maternalists asserted. Thus, the quest for matriarchy was central to their thought. If evidence for the existence of matriarchal societies anywhere and at any time could be found, then women's claim to equality and a share in power would have greater prestige and sanction. Until very recently, such evidence as could be found consisted of a combination of archaeology, myth, religion, and artifacts of dubious meaning held together by speculation. Central to the argument for matriarchy was the ubiquitous evidence of mother goddess figures in many ancient religions, from which maternalists argued for the reality and actuality of female power in the past. We will discuss the evolution of the mother goddess in chapter 7 in great detail. Here we need to stress only the difficulty of reasoning from such evidence toward the construction of social organizations in which women were dominant. In view of the historical evidence for the coexistence of symbolic idolatry of women and the actual low status of women, such as the cult of the Virgin Mary in the Middle Ages, the cult of the Lady of the Plantation in antebellum America, or that of the Hollywood star in contemporary society, one hesitates to elevate such evidence to historical proof. The ethnographic evidence on which Bakoven and Ingalls base their arguments has been largely disproven by modern anthropologists. Such evidence as held up turned out to be evidence not for matriarchy, but for matrilocality and matrilineal. Contrary to earlier held belief, it is not possible to show a connection between kinship structure and the social position of women. In most matrilineal societies, it is a male relative, usually the woman's brother or uncle, who controls economic and family decisions. There is now a rich body of modern anthropological evidence available, which describes relatively egalitarian societal arrangements and complex and varied solutions by societies to the problem of the division of labor. The literature is based largely on modern tribal societies, with a few examples from the 19th century. This raises the problem, especially for the historian, as to the validity of such information for generalizations about prehistoric peoples. At any rate, from the available data, it appears that the most egalitarian societies are to be found among hunting, gathering tribes, which are characterized by economic interdependency. A woman must secure the services of a hunter in order to be assured of a meat supply for herself and her children. A hunter must be assured of a woman who will supply him with subsistence food for the hunt, and in the event the hunt is unsuccessful. As we have earlier observed, in such societies, women supply the major share of the food consumed, yet the product of the hunt is everywhere considered the most valued food and is used for the gift exchanges. Such hunting-gathering tribes stress economic cooperation and tend to live peacefully with other tribes. Competition is ritualized in contests of singing or athletics, but it is not encouraged in daily living. As usual, scholars in the field disagree in their interpretations of the evidence, but the most thorough survey of the evidence yields the generalization that in such societies, the relative status of men and women is separate but equal. There is considerable controversy among anthropologists over how to categorize any given society. A number of feminist anthropologists and writers have interpreted complementary or even the absence of clear-cut male dominance as evidence of egalitarianism or even female dominance. Thus, Eleanor Leacock describes the high status of Iroquois women, especially before the European invasion. Their powerful public role in controlling food distribution and their participation in the Council of Elders. Lecoq interprets these facts as evidence of matriarchy, defining the term to mean that women held public authority in major areas of group life. Other anthropologists, viewing the same data and recognizing the relatively high status and powerful position of Iroquois women, focus on the fact that Iroquois women were never the political leaders of the tribe and were not the chiefs. They also point to the uniqueness of the Iroquois situation, which is based on the abundant natural resources available in their environment. One must also note that in all hunting-gathering societies, no matter what women's economic and social status is, women are always subordinate to men in some respects. There is not a single society known where women as a group have decision-making power over men or where they define the rules of sexual conduct or control marriage exchanges. It is in horticultural societies that we most frequently find women dominant or highly influential in the economic sphere. In a sample survey of 515 horticultural societies, women dominate cultivation activities in 41% of the cases. Yet historically, such societies move in the direction of sedentary settlement and plow agriculture, in which men dominate economic and political life. In the horticultural society studied, most are patrilineal, despite women's decisive economic role. Matrilineal horticultural societies seem to appear mainly under certain ecological conditions, near forest borders where domesticated animal herds are absent. Because such habits are disappearing, matrilineal societies are nearly extinct. Summarizing the research findings concerning female dominance, these points can be made. 1, most of the evidence for female equality in societies derives from matrilineal, matrilocal societies, which are historically transitional and currently vanishing. 2, while matrilineal and matrilocality confer certain rights and privileges on women, decision-making power within the kinship group nevertheless rests with elder males. 3, patrilineal descent does not imply subjugation of women, nor does matrilineal descent indicate matriarchy. 4, seen over time, matrilineal societies have been unable to adapt to competitive, exploitative, techno-economic systems and have given way to patrilineal societies. The case against the universality of prehistoric matriarchy seems quite clearly proven by the anthropological evidence, yet the debate over matriarchy rages on, largely because advocates of the matriarchy theory have been vague enough in their definition of the term to include in it various other categories. Those who define matriarchy as a society where women dominate over men, a sort of inversion of patriarchy, cannot cite anthropological, ethnological, or historic evidence. They rest their case on evidence from myth and religion. Others call matriarchy any kind of societal arrangement in which women hold power over any aspect of public life. Still, others include any society in which women have relatively high status. The last definition is so vague as to be meaningless as a category. I think one can truly speak of matriarchy only when women hold power over men, not alongside them, when that power includes the public domain and foreign relations, and when women make essential decisions not only for their kinfolk, but for the community. In line with my earlier discussion, such power would have to include the power to define the values and explanatory systems of the society and the power to define and control the sexual behavior of men. It may be noted that I am defining matriarchy as the mirror image of patriarchy. Using that definition, I would conclude that no matriarchal society has ever existed. There have been and still are societies in which women share power with men in many or several aspects of life, and societies in which women in groups have considerable power to influence or check the power of men. There also exist and have historically existed individual women who have all or almost all the powers of men they represent or for whom they act as stand-ins, such as queens and rulers. As this book will show, the possibility of sharing economic and political power with men of their class or in their stead has been precisely a privilege of some upper class women, which has confirmed them more closely to patriarchy. There is some archaeological evidence for the existence of societies in the Neolithic and in the Bronze Age in which women were held in high esteem, which may also indicate that they held some power. Most of this evidence consists of female figures which have been interpreted as fertility goddesses, and for the Bronze Age of artistic artifacts depicting women with dignity and signs of high status. We will be evaluating the evidence of the goddess in Chapter 7, and we'll discuss Mesopotamian societies in the Bronze Age throughout this book. Let us now briefly review the evidence in one particular case, which is frequently cited by advocates of the existence of matriarchy, that of Çatal Hüyük in Anatolia, present-day Turkey. James Millart's excavations, in particular in Hasseler and Çatal Hüyük, shed important light on early town development in the region. Çatal Hüyük, a Neolithic urban settlement of 6,000 to 8,000 persons, was built in successive layers over a period of 530 years, 6250 to 5720 BC. New towns upon the remnants of older settlements. Comparison of the various layers of town settlement at Çatal Hüyük and those of an even older, smaller village, Hasselar, built between 7040 and 7000 BC, offers us insight into an early society undergoing historic change. Çatal Hüyük was a town built like a beehive of individual abodes which showed little variation in size and furnishing. The houses were entered from the roof by a ladder. Each was equipped with a mud brick hearth and an oven. Every house had a large sleeping platform under which the buried skeletons of women and sometimes children were found. Smaller platforms were found in varying positions in the different rooms, with sometimes men and sometimes children buried under them, but never men and children together. Women were buried with mirrors, jewelry, and bone and stone tools. Men with their weapons, rings, beads, and tools. The wooden vessels and textiles found on the site indicate a high level of skill and specialization, as well as extensive trade. Millard found rush rugs, woven baskets, and many objects made of obsidian, which indicates that the town was engaged in long-distance trade and enjoyed considerable wealth. Evidence of a wide variety of food and grains and of domesticated sheep, goats, and dogs was found in the later years. Millard thinks that only privileged persons were buried in the houses. Out of 400 persons buried there, only 11 had ochre burials. That is, their skeletons were painted with red ochre, which Millard interprets as a sign of high status. Since most of these were women, Millard reasons that women had high status in the society, and he speculates that they may have been priestesses. This piece of evidence is somewhat weakened by the fact that of the 222 adult skeletons found at Çatal Hüyük, 136 were female, which is an unusually large proportion. If Millard then found a majority of the ochre burials to be female, that might simply fit the general population sex ratio. It does, however, indicate that females were among high-ranking persons, that is, provided Millard's speculation concerning the meaning of the ochre burial is correct. The absence of streets, a large plaza, or a palace, and the uniform size and furnishing of the houses led Millard to speculate that there was neither hierarchy nor essential political authority of Çatal Hüyük, and that authority was shared among the inhabitants. The first speculation seems appropriate and can be sustained by comparative evidence, but from this, it cannot be proven that authority was shared. Authority, even in the absence of a palace structure or formal governing body, might have rested in heads of kin groups or in a group of elders. Nothing in Millard's evidence proves shared authority. The various layers of Çatal Hüyük reveal an extraordinarily large number of shrines, which were extensively decorated with wall paintings, plaster reliefs, and statues. In the lower layers of the excavation, there are no figurative representations of humans, only bulls and rams, animal paintings, and bull horns. Millard interprets these as symbolic representations of male gods. In the 6200 BC layer, the first representations of female figures appear with grossly exaggerated breasts, buttocks, and hips. Some are shown seated, one in the act of giving birth. They are surrounded by plaster breasts on the walls, some of which are shaped over animal skulls and jaws. There is also one remarkable statue of a male and female figure embracing, and next to it, another one of a woman holding a child. Millard calls these figures goddesses and notices their association with both life and death, vulture teeth and jaws in the breast. He also notices their association with flour, grain, and vegetable patterns in the wall decorations, and with leopards, symbol of the hunt, and vultures, symbol of death. In the latter layers, there are no representations of male gods. Millard argues that the male at Çatal Hüyük was an object of pride, valued for his virility, and that his role in procreation was understood. He believes that men and women shared power and community control in the earliest period, and that both participated in hunting. The latter is based on the evidence of wall paintings, which show women participating in either a ritual or a hunting scene involving a deer and a boar. That seems a greatly exaggerated conclusion, considering that both paintings show large number of men engaged in hunting and surrounding the animal, while there are only two female figures visible, both with legs spread wide apart, which may indicate some sexual symbolism, but seems quite incompatible with women participating in hunt. From the structure of the buildings and the platforms, Millard deducts that community organization was matrilineal and matrilocal. The latter certainly seems likely from the evidence. He believes that women developed agriculture and controlled its products. He reasons from the absence of evidence of blood sacrifice in the shrines that there was no central authority and no military caste, and says that in all of Çatal Hüyük, there is no evidence of warfare over a period of 1,000 years. Millard also argues for the fact that women created Neolithic religion and that they chiefly were the artists. These findings and the evidence have been subject to differing interpretations. In a scholarly survey, P. Singh details all of Millard's evidence and puts it in the context of other such Neolithic settlements, but omits Millard's conclusions. Other than about the economy of the town, Ian Todd, a participant in some of the Çatal Hüyük excavations, in a 1976 study, cautions that the limited nature of the excavations of Çatal Hüyük makes conclusions about stratification in the society premature. He agrees that the archaeological findings show a society with a complex social structure, but concludes Whether the society was indeed matriarchal, as has been suggested, is unknown. Anne Barstow, in a careful evaluation, agrees with most of Millard's findings. She stresses the significance of his observations regarding the celebration of the fecundity and strength of women and of their role in creating religion, but finds no evidence for matriarchy. Ruby Rohrlich takes the same evidence and from it reasons for the existence of matriarchy. She accepts Millard's generalizations uncritically and argues that his evidence disproves the universality of male supremacy in human society. Rohrlich's essay is important in focusing attention on various bits of evidence of societal change in regard to the relations of the sexes in the period of the formation of archaic states, but her blurring of the distinction between male-female egalitarian relationships and matriarchy obscures our vision. Millard's findings are important, but his generalizations about the role of women should be used with care. There seems to be clear evidence of matriarchality and of female goddess worship. The periodization of the onset of that worship is equivocal. Millard links it to the onset of agriculture, which he thinks brings higher status to women. As we will see throughout, the opposite seems to be the case in many societies. Millard might have strengthened his argument by using the findings of one of his co-workers, Lawrence Angel, who found, by an analysis of skeletal remains, a significant increase in the average lifespan of Neolithic females over the Paleolithic, from 28.2 to 29.8 years. This gain in female longevity of almost 2 years must be considered against the average lifespan of 34.3 years at Çatal Hüyük. In other words, while men lived 4 years longer than women, there was a considerable gain in longevity for women compared with an earlier period. This gain may have been due to the change from hunting-gathering to agriculture, and it may have given women a relatively more dominant role in that culture. Millard's observations about the absence of warfare at Çatal Hüyük must be measured against the abundant evidence of the existence of warfaring and militant communities in neighboring regions. And finally, we cannot omit from consideration the sudden and unexplained abandonment of the settlement by its inhabitants, 5700 BC, which seems to indicate either military defeat or the inability of the community to adapt to changing ecological conditions. In either case, it would bear out the observation that communities with relatively egalitarian relations between the sexes did not survive. Still, Çatal Hüyük offers us hard evidence of the existence of some sort of alternate model to that of patriarchy. Adding this to the other evidence we have cited, we can assert that female subordination is not universal, even though we have no proof for the existence of a matriarchal society. But women, like men, have a deep need for a coherent system of explanation that not only tells us what is and why it got to be as it is, but allows for an alternate vision of the future. Before proceeding to the discussion of the historical evidence for the establishment of patriarchy, we will therefore present such a hypothetical model to free our minds and souls to play with possibilities to consider alternatives. And we will get into chapter 2 tomorrow. Thanks for listening.